Hello, welcome to another episode of Gen Server. In the previous episode, we learned how we can dynamically start our Gen Server process using the Dynamic Supervisor. And we did that by invoking the dynamic start child function, which takes into arguments the supervisor and the child specification. In today's episode, we are going to focus on the ID that we pass under the child specification. This is the child specification section, which is under the supervisor documentation. We are going to look at the ID. Here we are told that the ID is any term used to identify the child specification internally by the supervisor, defaults to the given module. This key is required for supervisors. In the case of conflicting ID values, the supervisor will refuse to initialize and require explicit IDs. This is not the case for Dynamic Supervisor though. So this is where my interest was captured. For the supervisor, the ID values needs to be unique, but for the Dynamic Supervisor, this is not the case. Let's head over to the Dynamic Supervisor and see what it says. Note that while the ID field is still required in the spec, the value is ignored and therefore does not need to be unique. That's where my interest was, because I was wondering if we need to pass this value, even we need to uniquely identify this value or not. At first I thought that if we pass the ID, this ID needs to uniquely identify the child process, and in that case we can start different child process with the unique identities. I'm going to start the interactive shell to demonstrate what my initial thought was. Here the ID is a static value, it's not going to change. Start the gen server process by calling the message server .start message server. It's going to start the gen server process with this speed. If I invoke that function again, I expect this return value, the error value, already started, because the ID is a static value. So at first I thought that this ID uniquely identifies a process. So I went ahead and decided to pass different values for the ID. So we can pass different values by fetching the ID from the arguments. Let's recompile that change. Now, if I call the message server, so the change has not been picked up, I'll just start the application. So my application has been started, and I'll go ahead and start the message server now. I've not passed any argument, and that means the first ID value is 1. Let's pass an argument. So the ID, I'll pass it as 2. I'm still getting the same error. So that was my initial thought. By passing unique values for the ID, it's going to start we can be able to start different child process, in this case the different gen server process. But that seems not to be the case, and the documentation has explained it well that this value is ignored. And we don't have to uniquely identify it. If you had an intention of starting different gen server process which are uniquely identified. You can do that by registering the GenServer process with different names or unique names. So in our case, the GenServer process is registered with a module name. That name is static, and instead of passing the module name, let's get the unique name from the arguments, and that will be the ID. Let's do the same thing that we did here. Cut this, pass it as 1 the way it was, and pass that as a unique value now. Start the application. Now you can start the GenServer process. We are getting an error, and in the error message, so this is an argument error. Inside here, the message is expected name option to be one of the following: nil, atom, or a tuple of an atom global and a term, or a tuple of an atom via module and a term. So what we passed as the name is a string 1, and this is not among the format that is required. So let's define it as an atom. We can just pass it as an atom in the arguments that we are passing. So the name will be keyword get ID. By default, we can name it as 1. Let's see if recompiling this will take effect. Okay, so it got 1 because I was interpolating it. So instead of interpolating, just pass as it is. Recompile again. Now we are able to start our GenServer process. The next GenServer process that I want us to start will be with a different name, and do that by passing the ID with the value 2. You can see the PID is different from what we had at first. If you have the intention of starting different GenServer process, you can register your GenServer with unique names.